In this chapter, we'll see how to implement another advanced component from Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC, the grid. One of our new requirements for the RPS Project Tracker version 2 list of backlog items is to make it pageable and sortable. The grid can handle these features, as well as over 100 other features including filtering, grouping, and editing. Because the grid is so configurable and there are so many features, I really suggest having the documentation site open while you develop so that you can use it for reference. And as I mentioned earlier, you should also have the grid demo site open. Now, while the grid can be data bound to local or remote data, in this chapter we're going to be rendering the data server side, and the grid will automatically fetch data from the server while paging. We'll see this in action shortly. So in this chapter, we'll set up the grid and configure it to display our backlog items, and then we'll add paging and sorting. In this lesson, we're going to start implementing the grid. If we take a look at the completed application and we head over to backlog, you can see the completed grid implementation here. Our items are listed here in the grid, and our filtering still works. And as you can see, when we filter the items, we do a post back here. So all the data that's rendered for this grid, we're doing that on the server side. Our paging is done server side as well. As you can see, when I use the pager, we get new URL parameters appended, and this is done for us automatically by the Kendo grid. And it's something that's interpreted on the server side by the grid component as well. If I do sorting, you can see that we have grid sort enabled in the URL, and it says sorting by title in ascending order. So this is completely automatic. We don't have to worry about setting this up or passing any parameters in the URL. This is done for us. Let's take a look at the existing application. We're going to head over to backlog. This is our starting point right now. And currently we just have a table. It's a nice looking table. It's styled with Bootstrap, but we need to convert this to the Kendo grid. Luckily, we already have all the data available to us, so we don't need to do anything on the back end. Let's head over to the code and let's open up the backlog controller. We'll keep that open just in case. And in the views folder, let's open up the backlog folder and the items view. This is where we have our current table displaying the data right here. And all we're doing is iterating through each item in the model and drawing the appropriate row for each type of data. For example, we have a couple of helpers here. RPS is a helper library that was already added in your project. If you look in app code, we have this RPS CSHTML with a few helpers here. We have a user avatar helper. We have an item type indicator and priority indicator. These three helpers are being used to render some of the data for the different types of columns that we're showing in the grid. We're going to come back to using these later on in this chapter. And that's why I'm not going to get rid of this table just yet. Instead, I'm going to add the grid right above the table. So right over here, right before the table, I'm going to open up my HTML helper. And this is going to be HTML Kendo grid. Now this grid function actually can take a data source. As you can see, there's lots of different options here. We can take a data table, or you can just instantiate it and configure it manually, or you can pass in an IEnumerable of t, which is the data source. And that's what we're going to do. Our model for this view is actually an IEnumerable of pt item. And that's exactly what we need. So let's pass in the model here. I'm going to save this and let's take a look. Oh, of course, we need a name for our grid. So let's go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to call that simply grid. Okay, there's our grid. And as you can see, it's already rendering all the columns and all the data by itself without any other specifications. So the grid automatically interprets what kind of data we're trying to show, sometimes correctly and sometimes not so correctly. And it's showing as many properties as it can from the PT item list. So as you can see, it has the estimate, it has the ID, the title. It's not showing some of the ones we want to show. For example, let's go down here. It's not showing the assignee because an assignee is the complex object inside the PT item, and therefore it doesn't know how to render that. It's also showing us the ID column. We don't want to show the ID column. So we need to figure out how we can control what it's showing and how it's showing it, and we'll do that a little bit later. But as you can see, for now, we have a fully functional grid already made for us just based on the data. If you take a look at this URL for the ASP.NET MVC Grid on the demo site, you'll see some basic usage examples and configuration options. This is a handy tool to have open. You can also see all the key features of the grid, and we're only going to be scratching the surface of what the grid can do here, just so that I can demonstrate the grid to you. But keep in mind that the grid is a very powerful component.
It can integrate inserts, updates, and deletes right from the grid. It can do exporting to PDF and Excel. It has row virtualization, so you can fit a lot of data in there. You can freeze columns. It can fetch more data on the fly from the client side. It's also responsive. You can specify which columns you want to collapse on smaller screens. So there's a lot of options. All right, let's move on to the next lesson where we're going to talk about the grid columns. All right, right now our grid is rendering columns based on how it sees fit. And while it's doing a pretty good job, it's not exactly what we want. However, that being said, I'd like to point out that if you do provide a data model that's appropriate for displaying the grid, then you will significantly decrease the manual configurations of the columns that you're going to need to do. But since we're binding to a list of raw PT items, then we need to do a little bit more configuration of our columns. So let's start with that. Let's head over to the code, and I'm going to access our columns configuration here. This is using our configuration options, which is a lambda. You've seen this pattern before many times in this course. Let's call this columns, and we can configure each of the columns here. And the way we configure the columns is by using the bound function. So this bound function is going to take a lambda to point to what column we want to configure. So let's start with the title, nice and simple. And don't forget a semicolon here. This is telling the grid that I want to bind the title column to the title property of our PT items. And when you define a single column like this, you override Kendo's own interpretation of columns. It's telling the grid that you want to take control of defining the way the columns look. So now it's only going to show you that one column that you've bound. In our case, it's title, and now all we're seeing is just the title column. So that means now we need to actually define all the columns that we want to show. I'm going to take a look here. We need the type column, the assignee, the title, status, priority, estimate, and created date. I think I'm going to skip status this time because it's really just showing text. So the order here matters as well. I'm going to bind the item type before the title, and that's going to make it display before the title. Now, when you bind one of these columns, you can also override the title that's displayed in the header. So in our case, I want to display nothing above the type. So I'm going to give it a blank space here. That's how you override the title so that nothing is showing. And you can also specify the width here. So I'm going to set that to 40 because all we need to do there is just display the icon. We'll get to the icon part, but for now you can see that we have a narrow column here displaying the types, and we have the title as the next column. Let's get the rest of these in here. I'm going to copy this one. We need the assignee, we need the title. I'm going to have the priority, estimate, and then the created date. So let's go ahead and bind these. Assignee, priority, estimate, and created date. Some of these are integers, some of these are dates, and some of these are objects. Let's see how the grid interprets displaying these. Okay, not exactly what we want, but at least we have all the columns there in the correct order. So what's the problem here? Well, we want to display the type as icons, that's fine. Assignee is actually displaying the entire object. It's just rendering the object to string. That's definitely not what we want. The title is great. The priority is okay, but we need to have some special styling, which we'll add later. The estimate, that's fine. We're also going to add a style here, a class. And date created is also going to be changed. We don't want to display such an unfriendly date. Let's take a look at displaying each column properly in the next lesson. We're currently displaying all the columns that we need to display in our grid in the proper order, but they're not being displayed quite right. Some of these are objects, some of these are dates, and some of them need special styling or an icon. And the way we can do that is by providing templates. Each column can have its own defined template. So let's head over to the code. I'm going to start with this date created. Right now it's being displayed as just a date to string, which is not very friendly. I'm going to add a template here just by calling template. And here we're going to provide a lambda function to configure the template. And this I here is actually the PT item itself. So really inside the template, we have full control of the item, so we can display it however we like. I'm going to return a span. And inside the span, I'm just going to get the item's date created. And I'm going to call toString with the formatting that I actually want. I want to show a 3-letter month, a day, and a year. Don't forget that semicolon at the end there. And I also want to style this a little bit differently. So I'm going to provide a class, I already have this class created. It's li date. Let's take a look. And there we go. Now our dates are styled nicely. They have a little purplish tint, a smaller font, and they're the correct format. I also want to change that title from date created to created. Notice how the grid automatically took our property name, which was date created, one word, and it recognized where the word breaks should be for the column title. So that's pretty good, although that's not what I want. I want to call this column just created. So that's a template. I'm going to create another template for the estimate here. An estimate is just a number, so toString will work just fine on that. And I'm going to give it a class of li estimate. I need a little plus here. Now, if you take a look at our table, the one we've previously had before, you'll see exactly where I'm getting this from. So here's our date column, and we had our item, date created, toString with that formatting that we just used, and the li date class. Same thing for estimate. Now, as an exercise, I'd like you to try and create templates for the rest of these columns. And you can even use this table that we had here for reference. So you can make the templates just like the table. All right, did you try that? Let's do that together now. I'm going to start with the first column, which is the type. Let's go ahead and provide the template here. And we're going to return a string with a div. Let's give that div a class of PT indicator. I'm not making this up. This is really in the table down below. You can check. And then we need the actual indicator. We have the RPS helper here to help us out. So RPS and then item type indicator image. And we can pass item.type. And as a second parameter, we're going to pass backlog icon. Let's close out the div here. And let's take a look. Okay, now we have the first column with the icons. Those are being shown. The estimate is also styled, and the created date is still styled. We have a couple more to do, and we're going to use the same technique for that. So for assignees, we want to show the avatar. So I'm going to provide a template here, and we already have a helper, RPS user avatar, and we can just pass in item.assignee, and the second is a class name. We don't need a class name here, so I'm just going to pass in null. We can leave the title alone because that's being rendered correctly. And finally, let's do priority. So that's going to take a template. We have a helper here for that as well. RPS priority indicator. And we can pass in item.priority in here. Let's take a look at this. Okay, that's great. So now we have all the columns looking like they should, including the priority with its own custom styling, the assignee showing the avatar. So it's looking pretty good. These are the column templates. One of our other requirements is sorting and paging for the grid. So let's take care of that also. Let's add sorting and paging to our grid. I'm going to head over to the code, and as part of the grid definition, I can add pageable here. Let's start with that. I'm going to head over to the site, and you'll see right away we have paging enabled. There are some default smart configuration options the grid assumes. For example, we have 10 items displayed. That's pretty reasonable. The pager is also responsive, and in the video on my small screen size, you don't see the numbers, but if I make it larger, you'll see the numbers here. So now I can switch between my pages. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this course, paging is done on the server side. So there is a GET request that happens when I click on one of these numbers with the correct parameters that are passed to the server, and the grid interprets those. I'm going to resize this back to the correct size, and let's enable sorting. Enabling sorting is just as easy. You make this sortable. Now we can go back, refresh, and suddenly our grid becomes sortable. I can click on title here, and now we're sorting in ascending order by title. I can click on title again to sort in descending order. And I can sort by estimate, by priority, and so on. So the smart defaults work quite well, but also pageable and sortable have their own configuration options that you can configure, and you can see the documentation for the grid here.
Under Data Management, Grid,
you have a lot of different options here that you can look through, and I'd recommend taking a look at this in detail for all the different options that are available for paging and sorting. One of these options is to be able to configure the page size. And the way I would do that is by going up here to our grid definition, and we can tap into the data source here. So the data source can provide us a configuration for the data source where I can configure how the pager works on the server. Source has a server function on it that I can call, And I can set the page size to be something other than 10. So for example, let's say I wanted 6 items. And now I can head back here and my grid will only have 6 items per page. However, now in the URL, we have our page size set to 10. So I'm going to clear this out. And by default, our grid will have 6 items. And when I start paging, you'll see that in the URL, the page size of 6 is populated. There's a lot more options that you can configure, and I suggest checking the documentation for that. Let's take a look at some grid events. So right now, we've lost the ability to be able to click on a row. I'm clicking right now, and I'm not navigating to our details page. That's something that should happen if I click on a row. A grid has the ability to hook up some events, just like a lot of other widgets in the library. So I can come here and specify events and configure the events. If I take a look at events here, you'll see that we have all these different events available on the grid. PDF export, saving, grouping, sorting, filtering, and so on. The one I'm actually looking for is change. This will allow me to call a JavaScript function like we did before, and I'm going to call this one onChange. Let's head down to the bottom here. I'm going to define a section for our scripts, and inside a script tag, I'm going to create a function called onChange. This will take some args. To get a hold of the data is not very straightforward, and that's why I wanted to include that here. When you click on one of the rows, you need to be able to find out some details about that row. Well, the event that's passed in has a sender, and we can find out what has been selected. The grid allows multiple selections, and by default, it's configured for single selection. But you can also configure it for multiple selection. All right, so we have our rows. I called it rows because this is going to return an array. We want the first one because we know that only one is selected. So I'm going to take the index of 0 here. And actually, I'm going to call this row now. Now we've got to find the item ID. And we didn't render an ID column for the grid. So how do we get a hold of the item ID so we can pass it to the details page? Well, I can just add on a client-side attribute to one of the columns. And the first column with our indicator is a good option for that. I'm going to tack on a data attribute, data ID. These data attributes are ignored by HTML, of course, and that's why they're useful to us. And inside my data ID attribute, I want to add the item ID. That's going to be i.id. And when that column data is rendered with the data ID property, now we'll be able to get a hold of it in our JavaScript code. So we're going to look at row, but we need to use jQuery here so we can easily get a hold of its children by using the find function. And we want to look at the PT indicator. This is the class that we've applied to the indicator column. This is going to return to us an array. We're going to take the first item in the array because we know there's only one. And now I'm going to use jQuery again to look at that item's attributes. The attribute that we want is data ID. So this will give us the item ID. Once we have the item ID, we can just redirect the window to the details page. I'm going to use backticks here for templated string, and we're going to redirect to backlog / here I'm going to include the item ID and the details route. Let's take a look. I'm going to refresh this, and I'm going to click on one of these rows. Now you might think that this should work already because we have an event defined and we're clicking on a row, but nothing is getting triggered. And that's because we didn't define the grid to be selectable. So this particular event actually requires us to be able to have the grid be selectable. So all we need to do is just come up here to the grid definition and make it selectable. But there is a caveat here. This is not going to work just yet. I'm going to fix it for you in a second. But I want you to see this error message because this might be something you come across and you'll know how to fix it. So I'm going to make this selectable, which will make the grid selectable, and that's fine. However, once I made the grid selectable, the grid doesn't know what piece of data to pass once you've selected an item. And the error you get is this one right here. There is no data source model ID property specified. You need to specify the ID in order for the grid to know what you're selecting. So the message kind of gives you an idea of where you need to specify this in the data source. And specifically, you want the model and then the ID property. Let's head over to our data source definition right here. And right after page size, I'm going to keep configuring it. I'm going to head to model and configure the model here, specifically the model ID. And I want to point that to the item ID. So this will allow us to have the grid be selectable. I'm going to click on one of these items and notice the grid row got selected, and then we got navigated to the backlog details page. I can head back and select another item like this one, and the ID of the item gets passed along as well. Now, if you just want to have a row that's clickable, there is an easier way to do this, and we're going to take a look at that next. One way to accomplish our goals in navigating from grid to the details page is by implementing events, and that's what we've done in the last lesson. But there's an easier way if all we want to do is handle a click on a row, and this is our old friend HTML attributes coming to help us out. So let's head back to the code, and instead of using this change event and making the rows selectable, I'm going to remove that. We're going to do something else. Let's go back up here, and right before the columns definition, I'm going to use something called row action. This will allow us access to each of the rendered rows in the grid, so we can configure it further. So there's our row, and our row has all these different items we can alter. We can set it as selected, alternate, insert mode, HTML attributes, that's the one we need, and we even have access to the data item itself, which we're going to use. So let's go ahead and add the HTML attributes that we need, and we're going to add the onClick HTML attribute, where we set the location to the details page. So that's going to go to backlog / and then here we're going to access the row properties again and the data item, which is a PT item, and we're going to pass along its ID here. And let's continue with the details route. So we're going to add this HTML attributes to each of the rendered rows. Let's take a look at this. I'm going to tap on one of the rows, and we get navigated to the details page. So that works just as we want. Let's take a look at this table underneath the covers. I'm going to select one of these rows here, and you can see that it's just being rendered as a table, an HTML table. So here's a row, and there's our onClick event heading to the correct place. Each row has an onClick event handler as well. Besides row action, the grid allows you to alter the row template, and here you can override the entire HTML structure of the entire row. And if you wanted to, you can even render what we had here before in our table and just provide this as the contents of the row without having to define every single column. But I'll leave that as an exercise to you.